Once you hear why he did this, it will change the way you look at strangers. In 2018, a woman was out for a walk in the blistering cold when she saw a teen girl coming towards her wearing just pajamas and oversized shoes. Turns out it was 13-year-old missing person Jamie Close, and boy did she have a terrifying story to tell. 87 days earlier, a man had broken into her home in the middle of the night, killed her parents, and then taken her prisoner. He brought her 70 miles away to his house where she was kept under a bed and largely forgotten about. She was just there for no apparent reason. When her captor left one night, she managed to escape, and that's when she ran into this woman on the road. Jamie's captor, 21-year-old Jake Patterson, was quickly found, and he immediately confessed. And this is why he did it. On his way to work one day, he stops behind a school bus and he sees a girl get on. He doesn't know anything about her, and he decides, I'm going to kill her family and I'm going to take her. He had no motive, he had no criminal history. This was truly random. This is why you should be careful what you put in the mail. In 2015, a man was asked by his neighbor to collect his mail while he was gone for a few weeks. A few days later, a large package arrives on his neighbor's front porch. The man can barely lift it, but gets over to his garage where he accidentally drops it and hears something break inside. Hoping his neighbor would think the damage occurred en route, he closes his squeaky garage door and forgets about it. But over the next couple of days, whatever was in that package started to smell so bad that he decides to open it up. Inside were two very important finds: his neighbor, who was dead, and a camera that was still recording. The police bring the man in for questioning and show him what was on the camera inside the box. It starts with his neighbor talking to the camera about how excited he is to mail himself home for his YouTube channel. Then, police fast forward to the very end where they see that the neighbor is now sleeping in the box, and then suddenly gets dropped and you hear a crack, and that's his neck breaking. And then you hear a squeaky garage door close. No matter how brave you are, do not try this. In 2017, three boys decided it'd be a great idea to walk through an active train tunnel. Initially, they seem really confident, they're joking, and they're taking their time. But their chipper attitudes are quickly replaced with panic as the tunnel just gets longer and longer and they're not seeing any daylight.
We're probably barely halfway.
Then they hear a train coming.
It's a train! I'm gonna get on the side.
You're about to hear one of the most disturbing true stories on the internet. In 1921, a German farmer woke up to find a deep set of footprints leading from the forest right up to his back door. Whoever had come to his house had not left yet. After making sure it wasn't just his family, he searched everywhere on his property and his house everywhere, and he could not determine who made the prints or where they went. A few weeks later, his maid abruptly quits, saying that every time she's alone in the house, she hears demonic voices in the attic. Shortly thereafter, he and his family start to hear the voices too. When no one's heard from them in a couple days, the neighbors go over to check and they find them in the barn. One by one, each of the family members made their way down to the barn where they were systematically murdered and stacked in the corner. To this day, no one knows who or what is responsible for this crime. This is why parents should believe their kids. In 2010, a 15-year-old boy started to notice that the door to his attic, which was in his bedroom, was always open. One day, when his mom's giving him a hard time about being lazy, he's like, well, you're one to talk. You always leave my attic door open. She's like, I haven't touched your attic door in months, and nobody else has either. Not easily frightened, the boy decides to leave the attic door open. And so he's laying in bed, and he kind of looks over at the door, and standing in the door frame is a figure staring right at him. He bolts, tells his parents, they don't believe him, and then 6 months later, they move anyway. A few years later, the boy discovers his favorite teacher actually moved into his old house. And so he jokingly asks her, you ever see any ghosts walking around your attic? Her face got completely serious and she's like, as soon as we moved in, the door to the attic kept opening. So we investigated and we found a trap door that led onto the roof. Someone had been crawling in through that entrance and living in the attic for years. This is why you should always be afraid of strangers. In 2014, a disturbing text message conversation between two classmates was uploaded to the internet. Annie and David are talking casually, and then Annie hears footsteps outside and goes to look. She sees someone standing in her yard and she assumes it's just Dave playing a joke on her, but it's not. Suddenly, the stranger starts sprinting towards her house. He smashes through a window, and now he's in her house. She freaks out, jumps in a closet, and tells Dave to call the police. She tells Dave that he's yelling for her to come out, and then Annie stops texting. When Annie finally writes back that everything's just fine, Dave realizes something. He wasn't talking to Annie anymore, Believe it or not, this is a well-documented true story. In 1947, an American ship picked up a horrifying distress signal coming from an unidentified vessel. The first transmission was all officers, including the captain, are dead. The next transmission was the whole crew is dead. The last transmission was I die, and then silence. The Americans trace the signal back to a ship that's drifting off in the middle of the Indian Ocean. They quickly assemble a rescue team who boards the ship. They find the entire crew has perished in the exact same position. They are on their backs with their hands up as if fighting with some unseen force, and they look like this. There was no physical damage to the bodies or to the ship itself. However, even though it was 100 degrees outside, it was 40 degrees on the ship, and the bodies were rapidly decomposing. As soon as they tie up the ship to tow it in, it explodes, and then it sinks. To this day, no one knows what happened inside of that ship. Some say it was a chemical leak, others aren't so sure. This is why you should always be afraid of Australia. In 2014, an 8-year-old and her family went on an extended vacation to, you guessed it, Australia. After a couple of days, she started having this horrible recurring nightmare where an alien would appear in her room and try to grab her with its tentacle. After a week of this, she is terrified to go to sleep, but her parents keep telling her that it's just her overactive imagination. One night, she swears she feels that thing grab her leg and she leaps from the bed screaming. Her family runs into the room and they see her hysterical in the corner, and then they look at the bed and they all gasp. It wasn't an alien. It was a 7-foot-long adult carpet python that had been sneaking in through the ceiling tile and into her bed to stay warm every night. Sometimes monsters are real. After his parents fell asleep at night, a 9-year-old would sneak downstairs into the kitchen and crush junk food. One night, as he's making his way downstairs, he swears he can hear someone in the kitchen, but his whole family's upstairs asleep. He peeks his head around the corner, and in the kitchen is this skinny man drinking milk straight from the carton with his back turned. The boy's terrified, sprints upstairs, tells his parents, who come right downstairs, they can't find anything. It looks like no one's been in the kitchen. And they ultimately blame their son, and they say, your imagination's just playing tricks on you. The kid knows what he saw, and for the next few days, he felt like everywhere he went in the house, he was being watched. Then one night, he's laying in bed looking at the vent on his ceiling, and he sees a pair of eyes looking down at him. Freaks out, runs to his parents, who come in, look everywhere, find nothing, and blame him again. A couple of weeks go by, and the boy starts to notice a terrible smell coming out of the vent on his ceiling. He convinces his parents to come in and actually cut into the ceiling and go look around, and they find that skinny man, and he's dead. Yes, the picture at the end is real. In 1876, a woman from a very prominent family in Paris goes missing. After years go by and no one has a clue what happened to this woman, friends and family ultimately mourn her death and move on. 25 years later, and this anonymous letter shows up on the Attorney General's desk, claiming that the missing woman's family had a secret. Intrigued by the letter, the police go to the family's home, show it to them, and ask to search the property, to which they say, go for it. They search, they don't find anything, but on the way out, they notice something very peculiar. At the end of some stairs was a door that was padlocked shut. When the family refused to open it, the police break it down and make a horrifying discovery. Cowering on a rotten straw mattress in a pitch-black room was the missing woman, now 50 years old and extremely malnourished. Her mother had imprisoned her there after they had fought over her boyfriend, and she had not seen sunlight or another human being in 25 years. This is why you should always look under the toilet seat before you sit down. In 2003, over a 5-day period in London, 3 women showed up to hospitals with the same mysterious symptoms. They say they woke up with these horrible bite marks on the backs of their legs, and then while they're at the hospital, they become paralyzed and die. Despite their similar symptoms, the women had nothing in common except that they had recently been to the same pub. Authorities immediately shut it down and do a thorough search inside of the pub, but can't find anything deadly, until one of the detectives goes to use the pub's bathroom. As he's about to sit down, he thinks he sees something moving in the toilet, so he gives it a little kick. Hiding in the toilet was one of the world's largest and most poisonous spiders, the Brazilian wandering spider, and now they needed to catch it. Boy, did this kid pick a good night to have his phone out filming. In 2008, a teen decided he wanted to film himself playing the very creepy Midnight Game. In a nutshell, you turn off all the lights in your house and you walk around from midnight to 3:33 a.m. And if at any point you stop moving, the Midnight Man will attack you. Around 2 a.m., the kid thinks he hears something in the kitchen, but he also thinks his mind's just playing tricks on him because he is playing this game. But he goes to check it out anyways. When he gets downstairs, he doesn't hear anything, but he does see that his door is now open, and when he goes to shut it, someone pushes back. He sprints away, goes upstairs, jumps into his room, but keeps filming. Moral of the story, don't sleep on the first floor. In 2014, a young woman woke up to strange noises coming from under her bed. When she finally worked up the courage to look, there was nothing there. The next morning when she got up, there were footprints leading right up to the sliding door that went right into her room. She instantly calls her dad, who comes over and traces the footsteps back to a house of a very troubled teen who admitted to spying on her. But he swore up and down he hadn't done that in weeks. They don't believe him, and they threaten to call the police if they ever see him on the property again. That night, the girl's on her phone in bed when she starts to hear the strange sounds again. This is why you should never watch my videos before going to bed. In 1986, a young girl opens her closet to find a man wearing a dress and holding an axe. He grabs her and ties her up, and then walks around the house and does the same thing to the rest of her family. While the guy is ransacking their house, one of the kids breaks free, runs next door, and tells his neighbor. The neighbor calls the cops show up, the family's saved, but the guy is nowhere to be found. The family leaves the house and stays with relatives in hopes that they'll catch this guy before they have to go back. But after a few weeks, they haven't caught him, there aren't any leads, and they say, you know what, we'll go back to our house anyways. As the family's pulling back into their driveway, the father looks up at one of the windows and sees for a split second the head of the man with the dress in their bedroom. They call the police, who go in and find pennies glued to the ceiling and weird writing all over the house, but they can't find this crazy guy. Until one of the officers found a secret crawl space in the basement, where psychotic killer Danny LaPlante had been living for 2 months. This is a highly controversial topic. In 2016, a man posted on Facebook that the local police were going to kill him that weekend. That weekend, he died under very suspicious circumstances that we will get to. Immediately following his death, his YouTube page, which contained footage from his home's camera system, went viral. One of his videos shows a large group of police officers standing in front of his house for no apparent reason in the middle of the night. Others show what he claims to be plainclothes police officers casing his property. But the most talked about video is the one where the van shows up in front of his house, revealing a guy with a fairly high-tech camera who just starts filming his house. The man was found dead in his home after it had burned down, and he was found to have stab wounds on his back and his stomach. His death was determined to be self-inflicted. However, the debate rages on online. What happened to John Lang?
February 19th, 2022, a 41-year-old woman named Paula Ruiz was working the reception desk at a 4-star hotel. Paula took a moment and grabbed her phone, and she saw there was a text from her 19-year-old son saying he would be picking her up after work on his motorbike. And just a couple of minutes later, Miguel, her son, actually walked in the front door of the hotel. After Paula had gathered up her things, she and her son walked out the front doors and they began walking to where Miguel always parked his bike. However, when they turned the corner, his bike wasn't there. Someone must have stolen his bike. Paula and Miguel began looking all over the place for Miguel's bike, and Miguel sees up ahead his distinctive yellow motorbike, and he sees some stranger is pushing it along. Miguel actually gets in front of this guy, and Miguel starts screaming at the guy to give him his bike back. Paula, she joins her son and taking videos and pictures. As this is happening, another man on a motorbike came flying up, and all Paula saw was this young man holding a aiming it at her son, and she leapt in front of her son. She raised her phone and took a picture. Seconds later, there was a loud bang. The gunman had shot her in the chest. This guy who had been trying to steal Miguel's bike, he took off, and the gunman, he too sped off down the road. Paula would be taken to the hospital, but she would die the following morning. The photo that Paula took of her killer was such a high quality photo that just 2 days after her murder, police were able to use that photo to find the killer as well as his accomplice accomplice, and they were both arrested. A 27-year-old Texas man named George Pickering III suffered a massive stroke. He was immediately admitted to a hospital where he was put on life support, and then doctors delivered some bad news to his family. It would turn out George was brain dead, and they advised the family that realistically they should consider pulling George off of life support because it wasn't going to do him any good. George's father was so upset he just left the hospital altogether. George's mother and brother wound up talking to doctors and saying that yes, we are prepared to pull George off of life support. After they consented to have this done, they put George on an organ donor list and then began making funeral plans. When George's father came back to the hospital later that day and found out his family had consented to have George pulled from life support, he was furious. He stormed out of the room and he found the doctors and he demanded they keep his son on life support just a little bit longer. But the doctors told him there really is no reason to do that, and in fact, all you're doing is jeopardizing the people that need his organs. George's father was so upset, totally distraught. He laid over his son and he just held his hands and stared at him and just prayed that his son would give him some sign that he was actually not brain dead, but his son didn't. And before long, the doctors began filtering into the room to begin the procedure of removing his son from life support. And when they came in the room, George's father kind of snapped. He ran out of the room, he went out to his car, and he got his gun and aimed the gun at the doctors and ordered them to stop what they were doing and leave the room immediately. Once the doctors and everyone left the room, George's father walked over, he locked the door, and then for the next several hours, he just kept his gun aimed at the door as he laid over his son and just kept looking down in hopes that his son would give him some sign that he was not brain dead. And so finally, when the SWAT team arrived, they began yelling into the room for George's father to put the gun down and let them come in. And George's father the whole time is just looking down at his son, hoping and praying that his son is just going to do something. And right as the SWAT team kicks in the door and comes into the room, George's father had reached down and grabbed his son's hand, and his son squeezed his hand back. And as soon as his father felt that, he dropped the gun and he surrendered peacefully to the SWAT team. And then the SWAT team put George's father on the ground, and as he's being detained, George's father is yelling for the doctors to come in the room, my son is okay. And sure enough, when the doctors came in the room, George was okay. He was moving his hand, his eyes were open, he was making good eye contact, and before long, he made a totally full recovery. He would later be told that had his father not stepped in when he did and bought him those extra few hours on life support, George would have died. As for George's father, he was ultimately sentenced to 10 months in prison for his aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, but he and the rest of his family think what he did was certainly worth going to prison for.
Today is a very special episode. I'm actually trying out a brand new format. We're calling it Storytime with Mr. Ballen, and I'm going to be interviewing a guest.
This is Storytime with Mr. Ballen. I'm Tom Segura.
We're going to look at the art of storytelling,
Heightening parts of the story, drawing you in, adding color.
how my guest employs storytelling.
Beginning as a comic, you have to have a level of comfortability to be like, I'm going to tell you stories. It's almost like you go like, I know this is going to be funny, but is the story a good story?
In fact, I'm going to be telling a story that I've never shared anywhere. This story isn't really on the internet. Like, we heard references to it.
I don't know where this is going to go.
It's good,
but I'm in, dude.
So, without further ado, let's get into today's stories.
This story has the best ending ever. In 2003, a 9-year-old was home alone playing video games when he thinks he hears his cat meowing on the back patio, so he goes downstairs to let him in. He sees a deranged-looking man standing on his back patio howling at the sky, who then quickly looks at the boy. He grabs a fistful of cigarette butts from the ashtray, stuffs them in his mouth before he starts howling at the sky some more. After the police take the man away, they come back to talk to the boy and his family. Turns out the man had severe autism and lived in that boy's house up until his mother passed away, at which time he was transitioned to a mental institution. He broke out of that mental institution to go looking for his mom, which is how he came back to the boy's house. 15 years later, that same boy is sitting on his same back patio when he starts to hear that same meowing sound, and he looks up and it's the same autistic man walking towards his house. Knowing the man's story, he invites him into his house. The man's face lights up, he runs inside and starts crying. He was finally home. The men become friends, and every week Tom goes home to visit.
In the 1950s, the Thorpe family lived in Dunbar, Pennsylvania, which was a small town of less than 1,000 people. And their property was right up against this forest that was right in their backyard. Their daughter, 2-year-old Anna, loved to play in their backyard, but she was instructed to stay on the grass section and not venture into the forest because the forest was snake infested. On May 5th, 1950, Anna was playing in her backyard in that grassy section, and her mother was in the kitchen looking out the back window into the backyard, and her mother looked down for a second when she heard her daughter scream. She looked up and Anna was gone. Well, after only a few minutes of looking, Anna's mother decides she has to call the police. The police show up and they launch this massive search, and word got out to the residents of Dunbar, and so virtually everyone in Dunbar showed up to be a part of the search. After the first 24 hours had gone by and they had not found any sign of Anna, they decided to expand the search area from a 1-mile radius to a 3-mile radius. There was a crew that was 3 miles away from where Anna had gone missing, and they found Anna, and she was alive. She was laying under this blackberry bush. All she had on was a single shoe. Next to her was a pile of clothes, and they brought her back to the search headquarters where they reunited her with her parents. A doctor looked at her, and the doctor said there's no signs that she was attacked. There's really no signs of any wear and tear on her at all. It doesn't even look like she was outside for the past 24 hours. When Anna was asked about what happened to her, she wasn't able to give any sort of meaningful answer because she's only 2 years old. The only way for her to have arrived at that spot was if she crossed 10 barbed wire fences. So this 2-year-old with no scratches on her body is found on the other side of 10 barbed wire fences. A May 7th article in the LA Times said the police were baffled by this 10-fence dilemma, and they said the only way it would make sense is if she had been abducted and dumped there. But the police also repeatedly said there was no evidence to suggest she had been abducted, but this is not the first time something like this has happened in this small area in Pennsylvania. 2 years earlier, and less than 10 miles away from where Anna went missing, another 2-year-old, Ronald Collier, also went missing in the same stretch of woods. His mother had been sitting with him on their back porch, which overlooked the same forest, and at some point his mother had gone inside, leaving Ronald sitting on one of the seats. When she came back out again, Ronald was gone. And the police got really frustrated with Ronald's parents because they felt like this is impossible. How could this child not turn up considering the timeline you've given us, which is you went inside for 10-15 seconds and your son is now completely gone. The search for Ronald continued for several weeks, but unfortunately it was ultimately terminated and they never found him. However, 2 years later, when Anna's case happened, people began saying it looks like Anna was abducted and placed where she was ultimately found inside of those woods. And so probably whoever or whatever took Anna is the same person or thing that took Ronald, but Anna was just lucky enough to survive.
This story goes to show that we just don't deserve animals. In September of 2017, a woman named Nan Hauser was floating in deep water right near the Cook Islands. Nan was a whale researcher, and so she was not remotely scared when she noticed a huge humpback whale swimming right towards her. Nan just thought, okay, well, it's gonna see me and it's gonna, go away. But the whale didn't do that. The whale swam directly at Nan and slammed into her side and drove her underwater. For 10 more minutes, Nan barely survived getting constantly dunked, but after those 10 minutes, she did manage to break free and she swam to the boat and climbed to safety. And it was only then, when Nan turned around, that she realized why this normally very peaceful creature was so aggressive. The whale was never trying to hurt Nan. The whale was trying to save Nan from the huge tiger shark Nan could now clearly see in the water. The whale was trying to hold Nan under its fin to protect her the same way it would its own cow. I'm very excited to announce that we just launched our YouTube channel for Redacted. So now you can enjoy listening to and watching these stories in our brand new, beautifully animated video format. And if you love binging things like I do, well, you're in luck, because we just dropped the first 3 animated episodes. Here's a snippet of the animation style. Enjoy.
Over the long term, Operation Ajax set the stage for Iran to become one of the US's most hated enemies. Operation Ajax may have made Kermit the man he always wanted to be, but he should have been careful what he wished for. While his grandfather, President Theodore Roosevelt, is remembered for becoming the first American to win the Nobel Peace Prize for ending the Russo-Japan War, Kermit is remembered for the lasting pain Operation Ajax caused. Unfortunately for the Roosevelt family, his legacy is having made many Iranians bitterly anti-American for generations and helping to destabilize the Middle East.
Why you think certain people just are drawn to these types of stories?
The whole category of true crime, strange, dark, mysterious, this kind of darker side of the internet, it's just part of human nature to be naturally curious because no one knows what happens when you die. And then on top of that, we're all sort of basically afraid of death. And so hearing about stories where like the worst thing happened to somebody that usually is pretty relatable, it's not common that, the victims in these stories are like celebrities. They're typically normal people that just were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And like you can feel like, oh my God, that could happen to me.
Yeah.
And so I think that's why there's an interest, even though it might just be, I like to learn what happened and what. No. At the core, it's because we all have this like slightly morbid curiosity. It's part of being human.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think also like there's a part of you when you hear this crazy thing that your brain actually is like, that can happen to you.
Yeah.
That could happen to somebody you know.
A lot of people go to the SEAL teams to kind of reinvent themselves because just about anybody can try out for the SEAL teams. I mean, that's really generous, but a lot of people can try out for the teams, and it's just who can make it to the end. It's a meritocracy. Can you suck it up and make it to the end? And if you do, you come out like born again, like the Navy SEAL version of yourself. I felt like I had a lot of things I had screwed up in my time in high school and early college, and I was really starting to get in the flow of being an adult, that this idea of reinventing myself, of going through this trial and being able to come out the other side, not the guy that f***ed off in high school and college, but the Navy SEAL John. Like, that's what they'll know me for. And I wanted to serve already. So it kind of checked both boxes for me. Can be the best version of myself and can do what my friends did when they got out of high school at 18. I can go serve. I became obsessed with the SEAL teams, like obsessed with the SEAL teams. I mean, I read every book that existed. I watched every documentary. I mean, I was fully committed to it.
Will Smith goes on Oprah, I think it was Oprah or some talk show, and he talks about his experience skydiving. Basically, it's like, my buddies were, we're gonna go skydiving tomorrow. And it was like, oh yeah, that would be so crazy. We'll go skydiving tomorrow. But he's like, we're not gonna really do that. And then it's like the next morning we get up and he's like, yeah, let's go get breakfast, guys. So like, no, we're gonna go skydiving. Like, let's go skydiving. And he's like, wait, we're really doing that? And they're like, yeah. And he's like, oh my God, I don't wanna go skydiving. I thought we were just like saying it last night. And he winds up, going with his buddies to the actual, airfield. And they're like signing the paperwork. And he's like, guys, are we really doing this? I don't wanna do this. Like, come on, it's not so bad. And so before long, he's like in the plane, up in the air, attached to the instructor. They open the door up and they're like, all right, it's your turn. And he's like, I'm sitting on the edge and I'm having like this full-blown crisis. Like, I don't want to jump. I'm terrified of jumping. And the instructor is like, all right, Will, we're gonna go on 3. 1, jumps. Really? And he was like, the second I left the plane, fear was gone.
Yeah.
And it was just this exhilarating experience of soaring through the air, of skydiving. And he was like, when I landed, he's like, I suddenly understood that there's always been this aspect in my life that I've sort of seen in other ways in my life, but it's the best things in life. This is Will Smith, not me. Best things in life are on the other side of fear. The way I look at it is like the things that you don't want to do, you'll be indifferent to. The things that you do want to do, you'll typically have if it's a big enough thing, the best things in life, so to speak, you will have some element of a fear response to it. Now, of course, if you're scared to go down in the basement because you hear an intruder breaking in, listen to yourself, don't go down in the basement. When it comes to like goal setting, everybody has something that they just really want to do, even if they don't admit to it. Deep down, they know fear is the thing keeping them from doing it. It's fear of embarrassment, it's fear of failure, it's a fear of all the things that make us human. It's the very select number of people in this life are still able to say, I'm going to still do that thing that scares the out of me, and have the best and most fulfilling lives. Not always, but they often do.
In October of 2002, Mark and his wife Kathy were on their way to a baby shower in Baltimore, Maryland. It would be a 7-hour drive from their home in Ohio, so Mark and Kathy tried to get out the door as early as possible, but one thing led to another and they got a pretty late start. By midnight, they were only about an hour away from their final destination, but they both desperately needed a bathroom break. And so they pulled into a rest stop in Frederick County, Maryland, which is about an hour outside of Washington, D.C. The rest area parking lot was completely vacant except for one car
car, which was a four-door sedan that was parked head-in right in front of the bathroom. Mark and Kathy pulled into a spot that was a few over from the sedan. They got out, they walked up to the restroom. Mark was done first, so he waited outside of the women's restroom for his wife. As he waited, he turned around to face the sedan. He can clearly see there are two people in the front two seats. A middle-aged man who's sitting behind the steering wheel looking directly at Mark, and then next to this guy is a sleeping teenager. And immediately, Mark felt really creeped out by these two guys. Finally, his wife did come out. He grabbed her by the hand and without any explanation, rushed them back to their car and began backing out. And as he did, he looked over at the sedan and he saw the guy behind the steering wheel was looking over at Mark with that same menacing look on his face. Mark also noticed there was something odd about the sedan's trunk. There was a fist-sized hole right above the license plate where you would normally put the key inside of. So the whole scene was just totally bizarre, and after Mark and Kathy sped out and were back on the highway, Mark explained to Kathy that there were actually two people inside of that sedan and they really creeped him out, and that's why he had grabbed her and rushed them back into the car. By the time the couple got to the baby shower in Baltimore, they had completely forgotten about their experience at the rest stop. About a week later, the couple was watching TV in their home when a breaking news bulletin came across, and it showed a reporter who was standing at the exact same rest stop that they had stopped in, and behind them was the same late model sedan that they had seen parked at that rest stop when they had pulled in. The headline of this special news bulletin was DC Snipers Caught. It would turn out that middle-aged man sitting in the driver's seat of the sedan staring at Mark was none other than John Allen Muhammad, and the guy next to him, the teenager who was sleeping, was Lee Boyd Malvo. These were the two men that were responsible for the highly coordinated 3-week-long attack that left 10 people dead in the Washington, D.C. area. The fist-sized hole that Mark saw on the back of their trunk was what they used to shoot through because it allowed them to stay concealed in the trunk while they were shooting. Mohammed and Malvo had been using that particular rest stop in Frederick County as a place to hide out in between their killings. When Mark and Kathy pulled in next to them, they were only halfway through their killing spree. Mark believes the only reason he and his wife were not targeted is because the killers most likely were trying to keep this rest stop off the radar because it was their hiding spot, and so they wouldn't have risked an attack there. Although, ironically, they would ultimately be caught in that rest stop. Mohammed was executed by lethal injection in 2009, and Malvo is serving a life sentence. On March 20th, 1980, significant volcanic activity began to occur all over Mount St. Helens in Washington state. The north face of the mountain had begun to visibly shake, and then by March 27th, there was steam coming out of the craters and vents all over the north side of the mountain. That April, scientists began to notice that there was this massive bulge that was growing on the north side of this mountain that was about 1 mile in diameter, and every day it was growing about 6 feet farther and farther up the mountain, and it was basically this massive undercurrent of magma that was going towards the top of the mountain, getting ready to explode. Initially, there was some speculation that perhaps this magma bulge is not nearly as big of a deal as people are making it out to be, that really, at worst, it could be a small eruption and it would have no impact on the surrounding areas. But authorities became skittish and were worried that they could just be caught with their pants down if this turned into a full-blown volcanic eruption. So they began evacuating the area. And for the most part, everybody evacuated, with the exception of a few scientists and some photographers and some really hardcore people that did not want to leave their homes. One of those people who had stayed behind was Robert Landsberg, who was a photographer, and on May 18th, 1980, he was out hiking about 7 miles away from the summit of Mount St. Helens, and he was making his way up to try to find a good viewpoint of that north face. And so finally, he makes his way up and he gets to a great spot and he starts taking pictures of that north face. While Robert is taking pictures of that side of the mountain, a 5.2 magnitude earthquake struck the area, causing that entire north face of Mount St. Helens to be sheared off and begin falling down the side of the mountain. It's this massive landslide. It's one of the biggest that's ever been recorded in that area. But what it really did is all of a sudden that entire magma surge that had been building up underneath on the north side, making its way up, suddenly is uncovered, and it causes this massive volcanic explosion shooting 15 miles straight up into the air. Along with this massive vertical blast, there was a simultaneous lateral blast basically pointed directly at Robert, and it sent these molten debris surging down the mountainside at 100 miles an hour or faster. Robert knew he had no hope of escaping this wall of magma and ash coming straight at him. So he decides, instead of trying to save myself, I'm going to take as many pictures as I can of this volcanic eruption, and then I'm going to try to protect the film. And so Robert took as many pictures as he could of this massive volcanic wall of death coming towards him until the very last second when he puts his camera into his bag, and then he holds it against his chest and lays down on the ground using his body as the last protective measure to try to save this film for posterity. 17 days later, they find Robert Landsberg's body, and sure enough, he was able to protect his film by laying on top of it. And so they developed the pictures that he took, and they're incredible. Here are the final pictures that Robert Landsberg took before he was killed by the volcano.
This is why you should always change your locks. In 2017, a college girl woke up from a nightmare drenched in sweat and decided to rinse off before going back to sleep. She propped her phone on a shelf, turned on some music, and then hopped in the shower. A few minutes later, she reaches for her phone to change the song, but stops suddenly. Reflected on her phone's screen was a person standing in the middle of her bathroom facing the shower. She somehow kept her composure, turned the water to scalding hot, and then ripped open the curtain and sprayed the intruder in the face. As they howled in pain, she ran past them to her kitchen to get her butcher's knife. In a panic, she can't find her knife, so she just runs out of the apartment and calls the police. The police go in and come out with a crazy-looking woman in handcuffs. One of the officers comes over to the girl and says she used to live here and she had copies of your keys. Then he pauses and looks down and brings up a clear evidence bag that contained her butcher's knife, and he says, "Looks like she wanted her apartment back." This is why you should always watch videos to the end. In 2003, a woman came home to her apartment to see that her door was unlocked. She went inside, nothing was missing, so she assumed she must have left it open. When it happened a few more times, but still nothing was missing in her apartment, she went out and got a camera, set it up in her apartment aimed at the front door. The next day, her door was unlocked, so she reviewed the footage. She watches in horror as late in the night, her front door opens and in walks this tall, creepy man who looks around and then walks towards her bedroom off camera. She immediately sprints out of her apartment and calls the police, who show up and tell her to go back in her apartment and just try to stay calm, and that they would put an officer right outside her door so she's safe. As she's sitting on the bed, totally traumatized, she realizes something. She only saw him enter her apartment on that video. She doesn't know if he actually left. As she's sitting there, she feels breathing on her ankles. She runs out, the cop comes in, and he finds the tall, creepy man under the bed holding a knife and a camera.
On the morning of August 7th, 1981, a 34-year-old wildlife photographer named Carl McCunn stood on the edge of a lake in the Alaskan wilderness and chucked a box of ammunition into the water. Carl was on the last day of a 5-month-long solo camping trip in a very remote area of northern Alaska. A plane had dropped him off here in early spring, and he had set up his tent by this lake. No people around for at least 100 miles. Carl looked up into the sky and listened carefully for the low roar of the plane that was supposed to pick him up today. The type of plane that was going to be picking him up today, it was his buddy Rory's plane. It was really small. He didn't need all of his ammo, so that's why he was chucking his ammo into the lake. And he decided that, you know what, I'll hold on to at least one box of ammunition. It was about mid-afternoon, and still no sign of the plane. The sun was beginning to set. This far north, the sun stayed out for nearly 20 hours a day in the summer. That meant it had to be near midnight. Carl knew his friend had officially missed the date, and finally he had to reset up his tent, but then another day came and went, and then another, and still no plane. Carl remembered something that made him feel sick to his stomach. On the night 6 months earlier, when he and Rory had discussed pickup plans, Carl remembered that night had been filled with drinking. Rory had also said that he would have to check his schedule first, and Carl, in his excitement about going on this trip, had just forgotten to follow up with Rory and make absolutely sure he could pick him up. Rory wasn't coming, and all of this meant now Carl was going to face a brutal Alaskan winter all by himself. But sure enough, he looked up into the sky. He saw a plane flying directly towards his camp. Carl ran in his tent and grabbed the most brightly colored thing he could find, his sleeping bag, which was bright orange, and began waving it back and forth to get the pilot's attention. Carl saw the plane belonged to the Alaska State Troopers. Carl could actually see the pilot looking back at him. He threw his fist up in the air in excitement. The plane just kept on flying away from Carl's campsite until it disappeared over the horizon. Lying inside his tent that night, Carl couldn't sleep. He didn't understand, why didn't they stop? stop. Carl has been stranded for weeks. He has read all of his books. He was looking for literally anything else to read. And suddenly he found something, his hunting license. Then he saw something that made his heart practically stop. He suddenly understood why that pilot had left him. By October, Carl was getting really skinny. By November, Carl was genuinely starving. On November 26th, Thanksgiving Day, Carl laid inside of his tent and made a diary entry. He wrote, "They say it doesn't hurt." Then he reached for his rifle and his last box of ammo. A single shot rang out across the lake. A couple months later, Alaska State Troopers would find Carl. Carl was deceased. What Carl had only realized later was that fist pump had sealed his fate because, like it said on Carl's hunting license, a single arm raised in the air is the universally recognized body sign for all okay, do not wait. If Carl had only read that hunting license a little bit sooner, he would have known to have raised two hands in the air for the universal sign that means pick me up.
In 1991, a man named Christopher Case was found dead in his bathtub, fully clothed in the fetal position. When police interviewed his best friend Sammy, she told them about a very disturbing phone call she got from him the night before he died. On the call, he told her that the previous night he had woken up to what sounded like whispering coming from underneath his bed. When he went to look, he couldn't move. As he laid helplessly, he watched a black figure pull itself out from underneath his bed. Once it was fully upright, it reached down and began choking him until he passed out. The next morning when he came to, he felt his neck and it was swollen and bruised. And then he saw blood on his hands and he saw that there were deep uniform incisions on each of his fingertips. As he's saying all this to Sammy and telling her how scared he is to go to bed that night, he suddenly stops and he says, "I hear whispering outside my room." Then the phone went dead.
Darsh Patel, who was a 22-year-old college student, was out hiking in a New Jersey state park along with 5 of his college buddies. As they were about to head down a particular trail, a man and woman come charging up the path towards them. And the man and woman immediately say, "Hey, don't go down this path. We were just down there, and for the past 10 minutes, a black bear has been stalking us in the tree line." Darsh and his friends tell the couple, "Thank you for giving us the heads up. We were actually going to go down that path, and so I guess now we won't." And so the couple, they quickly leave, and Darsh and his friends are sitting there thinking, well, now what do we do? As they're standing there, they start talking about, well, maybe we just go down anyways. There's 6 of us. I highly doubt that a bear is going to come out of the woods and attack 6 people, especially a black bear that is not known to attack people. Why don't we just walk down a ways, and if we see the bear, then we just turn around and leave. And if we see the bear, might make some good pictures. Let's just go down there and see what happens. And they start walking. And sure enough, about 10 minutes into their trip down this trail, they see this massive bear parked right in the center of the trail about 250 meters away from where they were. The bear did not appear to be doing anything. It was just sitting there. So Darsh and his friends are just standing there, not really sure what to do. So they start taking pictures and videos. And the animal starts walking towards them. Now it's 250 meters away. They recognize that this is a dangerous animal and we don't want to get too close to it, but they felt relatively safe. Even if it started moving towards them initially, they still felt safe. But the animal starts jogging towards them. At this point, the boys put their phones away, turn around, and they start hightailing it the other way. And somebody looks back and notices the bear is now sprinting at them. This causes the group to completely panic. They start sprinting back towards where their cars were parked. Absolute full panic back up the trail. No one's paying attention to anybody else. They're just running for their lives. And as they're turning their heads to look, the bear is gaining on them and gaining on them. Finally, after about 10 minutes of just running for their lives, they make it to the parking lot and they turn around. There's no bear, but there's short one hiker. Darsh Patel is still in the forest somewhere. The group starts screaming for Darsh. They know there was this aggressive bear chasing them, so they're obviously worried about him potentially getting attacked, and so they immediately call 911. Police show up and park rangers show up, and they go into the forest to try to find this bear and to find Darsh. And very quickly they come across this 300-pound bear all by itself, aggressively pacing around this lump in the middle of this clearing that had sticks and branches on it. It wasn't clear what it was, and this bear is just pacing in a circle around this thing. And as these 2 park rangers get closer, they're armed. The bear looks at them and makes a move like it's going to charge, and they elect to shoot and kill this bear. Later, the bear's remains would be taken to a laboratory, and inside of the bear's stomach was Darsh Patel. He had been killed and eaten by this bear, and that lump that was on the ground that the bear was circling was whatever was left of Darsh that had not been consumed yet. When they recovered Darsh Patel's phone, they went into his images, and they found he had taken one final picture before he was attacked. The bear was not malnourished, it was not diseased, it just decided it wanted to stalk, kill, and eat a human.
This is why you might not want to eat deer meat. In late 2019, a man and his grandfather were out hunting when they spotted something way off in the distance that just didn't seem right. A deer was howling and then lowering its antlers and charging forward like a battering ram as if it was fighting with another animal. But when they crept closer, they could tell that the deer was all alone and something was definitely wrong with it. The deer was repeatedly ramming its head into a tree, and then finally one of its antlers breaks off and it kneels down and starts chewing on the antler. As they're watching in horror, the deer in a sudden lurching movement gets up on its hind legs and then walks like a human into the nearby lake, goes under, and does not resurface. Turns out the deer had chronic wasting disease, which is a new, highly contagious neurological disorder that drills holes in the brains of those affected and leads to a distinct lack of fear and awareness and is always fatal. And now, scientists are concerned it might spread to humans.
In 2015, Jolie had just graduated high school and was planning to move away from her town and go to college outside of Alabama, and she was really excited about it. But she had a bit of a problem because she had this boyfriend named Lauren Brunner, who she had repeatedly tried to end the relationship with because he was so possessive, but she hadn't been able to successfully break up with him yet. Every time she tried to, he would threaten that he was going to hurt himself or that he was going to hurt her if she ever left him, and so she never quite followed through. But with college on the horizon and to her what felt like this fresh start once she left Alabama, she finally pulled the plug on her relationship with Lauren and made it very clear that they are done. And she was firm on that decision even when Lauren did start lashing out and yelling at her and pleading with her and doing everything he could to win back her affection, but it just wasn't going to work because she had moved on. For weeks, Lauren was trying to convince Jolie to change her mind, but again, Jolie just stayed firm on her decision. And after quite some time, it seemed like Lauren had finally got the message because his messages and cries for her to change her mind had stopped, and there was finally a little bit of distance between the two of them. On August 29th, 2015, Lauren would break that silence and would reach out to Jolie and ask her if she wanted to go for a hike with him, simply as friends. Jolie was naturally hesitant about this, worrying that, this hike as friends could very quickly turn into something more that she didn't want, but she did want to remain friends with Lauren. He was very important to her, and so she reluctantly agrees to go on this hike. After Jolie responded to Lauren that she was willing to go, Lauren was really excited, and so he posted on Instagram this picture of himself looking, I guess, excited. It's hard to tell from the image, but the caption basically said that he was excited about going on this hike with her and that things were, quote, looking up. At the same time, after Jolie had given that answer to Lauren, after she had agreed, yes, I'll go hiking with you, she texted her friend jokingly, if something happens to me, you'll know who I was with. The next day, on August 30th, Lauren picks up Jolie and he begins documenting their trip on his Instagram page. Jolie gets in the car and he takes a picture of her and he captions it, on our way to go hiking. The second image that he uploads is of Jolie walking her dog Kiba in a parking lot. It appears that this lot is at the base of the hike they're about to go on. The third image shows Jolie standing on a rock overlooking this forest and she's holding her dog Kiba. And it's clear, based on this picture, that now they've actually begun the ascent up this trail. The fourth and final picture that was uploaded to his Instagram page shows Jolie standing on a rocky cliff and she's holding her own camera up and she's taking pictures out over this valley. And the picture was captioned, Jolie the photographer. Immediately after this picture was taken, Lauren would shoot Jolie twice and push her off of that cliff. He was sentenced to 52 years in jail and bragged to the inmates he was with that if he couldn't have her, no one could.
Will Smith, the actor, has this great thing he does. He goes on Oprah, I think it was Oprah or some talk show, and he talks about his experience skydiving, this impromptu monologue he gives. But he basically is like, my buddies were, we're gonna go skydiving tomorrow. And it was like, oh yeah, that would be so crazy. We'll go skydiving tomorrow. But he's like, we're not gonna really do that. And then it's like the next morning we get up and he's like, yeah, let's go get breakfast, guys. So like, no, we're gonna go skydiving. Like, let's go skydiving. And he's like, wait, we're really doing that? And they're like, yeah. And he's like, oh my God, I don't want to go skydiving. I thought we were just like saying it last night. And he winds up, going with his buddies to the actual, airfield. And they're like signing the paperwork. And he's like, guys, are we really doing this? I don't want to do this. Like, come on, it's not so bad. And so before long, he's like in the plane, up in the air, attached to the instructor. They open the door up and they're like, all right, it's your turn. And he's like, I'm sitting on the edge and I'm having like this full-blown crisis. Like, I don't want to jump. I'm terrified of jumping. And the instructor is like, all right, Will, we're going to go on 3. 1, jumps. Really? And he was like, the second I left the plane, the fear was gone.
Yeah.
And it was just this exhilarating experience of soaring through the air, of skydiving. And he was like, when I landed, he's like, I suddenly understood that there's always been this aspect in my life that I've sort of seen in other ways in my life, but it's The best things in life, this is Will Smith, not me. Best things in life are on the other side of fear. And so what I've taken that as, becoming a Navy SEAL, for example, when I decided to do it, there's a huge amount of fear and not so much fear of failure, it's fear of not stacking up. Like when I got there, I was so intimidated by the people around me, but I knew if I could just not let the fear overwhelm me, that the reward on the back end would be so high. I just did a live tour with 15 shows. I actually am terrified of public speaking. I've had instances in my life where I have frozen up publicly giving a speech and literally had to put the microphone down and leave. I've had that experience, and I'm volunteering to do a tour with thousands of people. The way I look at it is the things that you don't want to do, you'll be indifferent to. The things that you do want to do, you'll typically have if it's a big enough thing, the best things in life, so to speak, you will have some element of a fear response to it. Now, of course, if you're scared to go down in the basement because you hear an intruder breaking in, listen to yourself, don't go down in the basement. When it comes to goal setting, everybody has something that they just really want to do, even if they don't admit to it. Deep down, they know fear is the thing keeping them from doing it. It's fear of embarrassment. It's fear of failure. It's a fear of all the things that make us human. It's the very select number of people in this life are still able to say, I'm going to still do that thing that scares the out of me, have the best and most fulfilling lives. Not always, but they often do. Will Smith goes on Oprah and he talks about his experience skydiving. It's this unbelievable monologue. My buddies were, we're going to go skydiving tomorrow. And it was oh yeah, that would be so crazy. We'll go skydiving tomorrow. But he's like, we're not going to really do that. And then the next morning we get up and he's like, yeah, let's go get breakfast, guys. So no, we're going to go skydiving. Let's go skydiving. And he's like, wait, we're really doing that? And they're like, yeah. And he's like, oh my God, I don't want to go skydiving. I thought we were just saying it last night. And he winds up going with his buddies to the airfield. And they're signing the paperwork and he's like, guys, are we really doing this? I don't want to do this. Come on, it's not so bad. And so he's in the plane up in the air attached to the instructor and they open the door. All right, it's your turn. And he's like, I'm sitting on the edge and I'm having this full-blown crisis. I don't want to jump. I'm terrified. And the instructor's like, all right, Will, we're going to go on 3. 1, jumps. Really? And he was like, the second I left the plane, fear was gone. The best things in life are on the other side of fear.
In 1944, when Ed was 38 years old, he and his brother Henry were burning away some marsh vegetation on their property. And at some point, the fire got out of control. That night, Henry's body was found face down in the marsh in that same area where the burn was going on. He had died of asphyxiation. Shortly after his brother's death, Ed's mother also died, leaving Ed alone in this farmhouse. While living in seclusion, Ed became obsessed with cannibalism. Then, in November of 1957, a local hardware store owner, Bernice Worden, goes missing. When police show up at the store, they find bloodstains all over the place, and they discover in the register that the last person to make a purchase inside of the store was Ed Gein. Ed was taking human body parts and making things like kitchen utensils and bowls, and he was using skin to create seats. Bernice Worden's body was found as well, and she was kind of hung up as if she was next up. When questioned, Ed confessed to killing Bernice Worden, but as for the dozens of other bodies that were inside of the house, he claims they were from robbing graves, but no one really knew if that was true or not, and they weren't able to ever actually convict him for anything beyond the killing of Bernice Worden. What he intended to do was build what he called a woman suit that would resemble his mother, and it would allow him to, quote, crawl into his mother's skin. He was deemed unfit to stand trial, and he was sent to a mental hospital where he stayed until his death in 1984. Women began disappearing in droves. The Picton's neighbor heard a frantic knock on their front door, and what they saw was this woman who was hunched over and dangling from her wrist was a handcuff. While she was in recovery, she told her nurses that her name was Wendy, and Robert Picton had tried to put a handcuff on her, and when he did, she fought back. She him in the face before turning and running out the door. Robert Picton actually showed up at the exact same hospital with a serious laceration on his face that was consistent with being stabbed. They searched Robert and they found a handcuff key. And that handcuff key opened the handcuff that was still on Wendy's wrist. He explained to officers that Wendy was lying, and Robert said he was just lucky to be alive. The police believed him and dropped all of his charges. Bill Hiscox, the one worker who still worked for the Pictons, called the Crime Stoppers tip line, and he told them that he thought Robert had actually attacked Wendy, not the other way around, and that actually Robert was most likely behind these missing women, but they weren't taking him seriously. A former employee of the Picton farm came forward to police and said said that he personally had seen illegal weapons inside of Robert's trailer. And this was enough information for the police to get a search warrant, and they found several items directly connected to some of the missing women. Robert was arrested and charged with murder. He shared his cell with another man. He was actually an undercover police officer, and their entire interaction was being recorded.
I find the best way is full something big in the ocean. Bigger than that. They're very bad. You fill the syringes up with antifreeze and you inject yourself. And you're dead in better than 10 minutes. I was going to do one more. Maybe even 50.
A rendering plant takes animal waste products and turns them into a gelatin. Robert's victims wound up in things like lipstick and gummy bears. Investigators were only ever able to find little bits of remains of 26 women, but only 6 turned into convictions due to a lack of evidence. He was sentenced to life in prison and is still alive today. This is why you might not want to hang up on that prank caller. October 21st, 2012 was quite possibly his daughter's apartment where he was also staying. He happened to notice there was a street lamp with this big poster, this picture of this middle-aged woman whose name was Chun Yan Chui, and apparently she was missing. She also lived in the same building that his daughter lived in, except Chun was a dementia patient and she was staying on the 5th floor where there was this memory care facility, and that's where she was being taken care of. And about a week earlier, she had gone out and just not returned. He sort of felt bad for her. Jung turned and just continued inside the apartment building. He made his way over to the elevator. He noticed he had accidentally hit the 6th floor, and he hit floor 7. But by the time he hit floor 7, the car had come to a stop on floor 6. When the doors opened, Jung just began to scream. Jung's daughter was finishing up at work when she got a phone call from her dad. She hears her dad screaming incoherently, and all Jung's daughter can hear is that her dad is saying he's trapped in an elevator. But she told her dad, "I'll call the building, we'll get you some help." It would take Jung's daughter about 40 minutes to get back to her apartment. By the time she got there, she saw a crowd of police officers just standing there. She didn't see her dad anywhere. She noticed one of the officers was on the phone talking to her father. Jung's daughter walks up to this officer and says, "I'm his daughter. What's going on?" Explains to her that we can't get him out. The only way for him to get out is for him to do something really specific. And right now, he's refusing to do it. The officer explained to the daughter what was going on inside of that elevator car. She took the phone and she began talking her dad through what he really needed to do. A couple of minutes later, the elevator doors opened up and Jung came stumbling out. It would turn out that missing woman, she actually did come back to her apartment. When she got on the elevator, she accidentally pressed the 6th floor. She gets to the 6th floor, she steps off the elevator car. The 6th floor was actually a private residence, and the person who lived on that floor installed a metal gate in front of the elevator doors. You basically would step onto a little platform and then you'd be hit with the gate. As she was trying to figure out, where am I? The doors to the elevator closed, and she had no way to open them up again because the buttons to access the elevator were beyond the gate. She's trapped between the gate and the elevator doors. The only person who would come to the 6th floor is the owner of that residence, and they were on vacation. And after 5 days of this, she eventually died. And then a couple of days later, Jung rides to the 6th floor, the doors open, Chun's body fell backwards onto him, pinned him to the ground. He gets out from underneath her. She was lying on the ground with her feet jutting out, blocking the doors from closing. Police tell Jung, "You just gotta move the body," and Jung basically couldn't handle it until his daughter hopped on the phone and said, "You gotta do it." The owner of the 6th floor residence was not held criminally responsible. However, he would end up paying Chun's family about $97,000 equivalent to compensate for her death.
When you finish this video, you're gonna Google 3 words. In 2014, a German man and his friends went on vacation to a seaside resort in Bulgaria. On the last day of his trip, he got in a fight with 4 other guys over a soccer match, leaving him with a perforated eardrum. A doctor prescribes him an antibiotic and advises him not to fly home the next day with his friends because a change in air pressure could further damage his eardrum. So, his friends take off the next day and he decides to stay one more night and checks into a cheap hotel. That night, his mother gets a distressing phone call from him where in a low whisper he says that 4 men are coming to kill him and that she should cancel all of his bank cards. Footage from that night in the hotel shows him pacing up and down the hallway and even hiding in an elevator. Early the next day, he heads to the airport, but before he goes through security, he does something truly unexplainable that was captured on camera and has been viewed millions of times across the internet. He He stops, drops all of his things, turns around and sprints out of the airport yelling, "I don't want to die here," climbs a barbed wire fence, disappears into the forest, never to be seen again.
51-year-old Susan Kuhnhausen was returning from her job. Susan was fighting with her husband Mike. Their marriage had become toxic. She wanted a divorce. She went in the back door. She saw a note that her husband had left. "Sue, I've had trouble sleeping. I'll see you in a couple of days." Kicked off her shoes and then began walking across the house. She noticed the first floor bedroom was really dark. A man she didn't recognize walked out from behind the bedroom door and started walking towards her. He had yellow rubber gloves on and he was holding a hammer. She had been an emergency room nurse for the past 30 years, trained regularly in self-defense. Sue ran at this guy, rams him into the wall. She's screaming at him, "Who are you?" And the man would say, "You're strong." She managed to wrestle the hammer away from him, smashed him in the head 3 times, grabbed his throat, and began choking the life out of him. She threw him to the ground and began to run towards the front door. But this guy jumped up, grabbed her by the ankle, and tripped her to the ground. He bit down as hard as she could on the inner part of his upper leg. Sue grabs him and throws him to the ground until she reaches out and puts her arm over his throat, and she proceeded to choke him to death. She grabbed his hammer, walked to her neighbor's house, calls the police, and tells them what happened. Her attacker turned out to be 59-year-old Ed Haffey. They discovered Ed's backpack. In it was a notebook that contained instructions what to do after he killed Susan. Call Mike. Mike was Susan's husband. He had paid Ed $50,000 to kill his wife. When police brought Mike in, he would eventually confess and then would be sentenced to 7 years in prison. Mike would die shortly thereafter in prison. Susan, she never faced any criminal charges and in fact was hailed as a hero in the wake of the attack.
The pain of staying the same is greater than making a change. If you're at that point, you kind of know it. Think about what matters to you, whatever it is. I like to equate it to when you're in the shower by yourself and you're just having unfiltered true thoughts. Ask yourself, what do you really care about? Like, honest to God. Forget what society says you should care about. Let's say you really just want to be famous. That's the actual core. And you don't even know why, but that's what you want. Well, guess what? Listen to that part of you. It's not vain. It's a thing that matters to you. For me, honestly, the reason the SEAL thing, I wanted to do it ultimately, is I wanted people to say, that's John Allen, the Navy SEAL. Because to me, it was like I had been the black sheep in my family. Because of me, I had discovered this, but it's like, oh, his sisters have done this. Oh, his dad's done this. His mom's done this. And then there's John. I wanted something that sort of overrode the mediocrity and failure. And I felt like, what better thing? What more honorable thing? And also, I wanted to serve. That's another check. It's a big goal. That's difficult. That's check. But ultimately, it was like, I want people to know that I became a Navy SEAL. That mattered to me. And you know what? It flies in the face of what Navy SEAL instructors tell you, which is, you shouldn't do this because you want to be a Navy SEAL. You should do it because you want to serve the country. And like, that's true. And what else are you going to tell your students?
Yeah.
But if you really want to be real about it, you got to find your real motivation, and that box must be checked.
Must be checked.
Yeah.
On a U.S. military ship in the wardroom, which is the officer's lounge, when the operations officer came inside. This guy was the definition of not a morning person. He was bleary-eyed, he kind of stumbled in, he was like a zombie holding a bagel. He sits down in front of me, he's barely conscious, and he starts gnawing on his bagel, and I'm sitting with my back to the outboard side of the ship. So that's the outside of the ship behind me, and there's a porthole right next to my head where the sun is coming through and it's hitting this officer directly on his face. And so the officer's looking up at the sun, he's kind of squinting and blocking the sun from his face, and I'm looking at him expecting him to shift left or right to get out of the path of the sunlight. But instead, this officer slowly reaches for the phone on the wall, he brings it up to his head, and he goes, "Yeah, Bridge, yeah, this is Ops. I need you to adjust our path. Yeah, 156, yep, that's about right. Okay, all right, bye." After he hangs up with the bridge, I'm watching him and he hasn't moved. He's still just looking at the sunlight blazing in on his face. He's just squinting and looking up at it. And then all of a sudden, this port of sunlight just gradually begins to shift off of him and winds up on the wall right behind him where it stops. By ordering the bridge to change the ship's path just slightly, about 15 degrees, it's enough of a change to reposition the sun from his face. He literally redirected thousands of tons of steel and hundreds of people just because he was too lazy to move left or right. I'm in awe. I can't believe he's just done this, and for a second, I worry that he won't realize how unbelievably brilliant this was. And then as I'm looking at him, in between bites, he just looks up at me and smiles and goes back to eating his bagel. on a US military ship, and the operations officer came inside. This guy was the definition of not a morning person. He was bleary-eyed, he kind of stumbled in, he was like a zombie holding a bagel. He sits down in front of me, he's barely conscious, and he starts gnawing on his bagel, and I'm sitting with my back to the outboard side of the ship. So that's the outside of the ship behind me, and there's a porthole right next to my head where the sun is coming through, and it's hitting this officer directly on his face. And so the officer's looking up at the sun, he's kind of squinting and blocking the sun from his face, and I'm looking at him expecting him to shift left or right to get out of the path of the sunlight. But instead, this officer slowly reaches for the phone on the wall, he brings it up to his head, and he goes, "Yeah, bridge, yeah, this is ops. I need you to adjust our path. Yeah, 156, yeah, that's about right." And then all of a sudden, this port of sunlight just gradually begins to shift off of him and winds up on the wall right behind him where it stops. By ordering the bridge to change the ship's path just slightly, about 15 degrees, it's enough of a change to reposition the sun from his face. He literally redirected thousands of tons of steel and hundreds of people just because he was too lazy to move left or right. I'm in awe. I can't believe he's just done this, and for a second, I worry that he won't realize how unbelievably brilliant this was. And then as I'm looking at him, in between bites, he just looks up at me and smiles and goes back to eating his bagel. 27-year-old Michalina Lewandowska was surprised when she got a text message from her on-again, off-again boyfriend, 27-year-old Marcin Kasperzak. The pair had actually previously been engaged and had a 3-year-old son together, but they just could never seem to make it work for longer than a couple of months at a time. In the text message, Marcin was asking Michalina if he could take her shopping, something he knew she liked to do. As for Michalina, lately she had been turning down requests like this one from Marcin, and she was inclined to at first, but their son was already being looked after by her mother, and Michalina didn't have plans that day, and so she thought, you know what the heck? And so she said yes. So Michalina took a shower and got ready, and even put on her engagement ring that Marcin had given her, and then she waited by the door. A little while later, Marcin, who was an aspiring bodybuilder who had become addicted to taking steroids, showed up at her Huddersfield, England home. Michalina opened the door, Marcin came inside, and then as soon as the door shut behind him, he tased Michalina, he jumped on top of her, and then he bound and gagged her. And then once she was restrained on the ground with no idea what was going on, Marcin opened the front door and waved down to his car that was parked on the curb, and one of his friends, this 18-year-old named Patrick, came out and walked up to the house and came inside. And then Patrick and Marcin worked together to cram Michalina into this small, rugged cardboard box, and then once she was forced inside of there, they closed it up, taped it shut, and then brought the box down to the front of the house and put it into Marcin's trunk. And then Marcin and Patrick hopped in the front 2 seats of the car and drove off. Once they reached the outskirts of town, they parked in a parking lot right next to this huge forest. And from there, they took the box with Michalina inside of it and 2 shovels and walked into the woods, and at some point they left the path and walked way away from where anybody would normally be until they felt like they were far enough away that no one would see them. And at that point, they put Michalina down, and then using their shovels, they dug a grave. Once it was deep enough, they put Michalina in her box inside of the grave, and then they covered her back up with dirt and then put a 90-pound log on top of her, and then the 2 of them just walked away, leaving Michalina to die. In the box, Michalina was not dead yet, but she knew if she attempted to escape with Marcin and Patrick right above her, they would just kill her on the spot, or they would dig an even deeper hole, and then it would be impossible to get out again. And so after waiting an agonizingly long amount of time to ensure Marcin and Patrick had gone, Michalina jumped into action. She immediately tried to wriggle her way out of her restraints, but the position they had forced her into, which was basically the fetal position with her hands tied behind her back, it didn't allow her to move very much in any one direction, and so without any movement, she could not get herself to come free of these restraints. And so as she's struggling, trying to figure out what she's going to do, she realizes she had chosen to wear her engagement ring that Marcin had given her, something she never wore anymore, and she could potentially use the diamonds in the ring to cut through the tape that was keeping her wrists tied together. And so she began working that ring until finally she did cut through her restraints and her hands were free. And so she managed to force both of her arms right in front of her body, and then once they were in front of her, she immediately began scratching and clawing at the cardboard right above her. And eventually she scratched a hole in the box itself, and dirt began pouring in on her, and she was already very low on oxygen. She was fighting off unconsciousness by remembering that her 3-year-old son needed her her, and she had no idea what Marcin was going to do to him. And so she just kept on digging and fighting as the dirt's coming in on her and she's struggling to breathe. And then finally she pokes all the way through and she can see sunlight and fresh air comes into the hole. She can breathe again. And then with this huge surge of adrenaline, she forces herself and manages to push all the way up through this hole until she's standing in her grave. And from there, she pulls herself up and out of the dirt and she runs towards the road where she flags down a motorist, and the motorist would call police and then wait with her until they arrived. After Marcin was arrested, the story came out that he had heard a rumor that Michalina was going to be leaving him and going back to Poland with their son, and he didn't want that, so he had decided he was going to kill her. Marcin was found guilty of attempted murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison, and Patrick was found guilty of kidnapping and sentenced to 4.5 years in prison. Late one afternoon in April of 2019, a middle-aged woman named Mary was cutting up some vegetables in her kitchen in northern Spain when she heard a knock on her front door. So she put her things down, she went to the door, opened it up, and standing there was her next door neighbor, who was all smiles, and she was holding this big box that was wrapped in wrapping paper and had a big bow on it, and then sitting on top of this big gift was a tray of deep-fried rolls, or croquettes. Mary's neighbor was a 61-year-old woman named Carmen Marino, who was an exceptional chef, and her specialty were making these croquettes. They were filled with different types of meat and other things, and all the time, Carmen would come over and give them to Mary, and Mary loved these croquettes. And so as soon as she saw those, she was like, wow, amazing, and she invited Carmen inside. But Carmen didn't come inside. Instead, she took the croquettes and handed them to Mary, and Mary's like, okay, great, thank you. But Carmen was still standing right outside holding this box, and now Mary's looking at her thinking that Carmen looks kind of uneasy. And so Mary said, what's going on here? What's up with this box? Carmen was silent for a second and just kind of held this box out, at which point Mary realized, okay, so she's trying to give me this gift. And so Mary reached out and took this huge present, and she was like, thank you, Carmen. Like, what is this? What's going on? And Mary, when she looked at Carmen, she could tell Carmen's face was now bright red. She was very embarrassed about something, maybe whatever she was going to say. And so Mary just waited for Carmen to speak. And so eventually Carmen she would clear her voice, and then she would say, Mary, this is really embarrassing, but I need you to hold on to this box for a little bit. It contains my sex toys, and I'm having company over at my house, and I'm just worried that somehow they're going to find these things. Mary was so caught off guard by what Carmen was telling her that she just started laughing. But Carmen didn't join in on the laughter. She just kind of looked down like she was totally mortified. Mary stopped laughing because she felt bad, and then Carmen kind of elaborated on why she had this huge box full of sex toys. She would tell Mary that, she bought them with the intent of using them with her boyfriend, but a couple of months ago he had broken up with her. But Carmen had held on to these in the hopes that the boyfriend would eventually take her back and they would get back together again and get to use these toys. And so even though this was a totally weird and kind of uncomfortable request, Mary kind of felt bad for Carmen. One, because she had to make this request of Mary, but also two, it was obvious that Carmen was pretty shaken up about, losing her boyfriend. And so Mary said, you know what? No problem, Carmen. I will look after your sex toys and I will enjoy your croquettes. And Carmen was so relieved and said, thank you so much. And then she turned and hustled back to her house. And then Mary shut the door and she brought the croquettes into the kitchen and she tried one and it was so good. And then she took the big box of sex toys and she went into the hallway. She opened up a closet and she put it on the top shelf and then shut the door. Over the next couple of days, Mary expected Carmen to come back over and reclaim her box of sex toys. But Carmen didn't. And when days turned into weeks and then turned into months, and still Carmen had not come over to get the sex toys, Mary was kind of annoyed, but she was just too embarrassed to go over to Carmen and be like, hey, why don't you come over and get your sex toys? And so Mary just decided she would leave it alone and not talk about it, and if ever Carmen wanted them back, she could have them, but if she never asked for them again, Mary didn't care. She would just eventually throw the box away, and that would be it. A few months later, on September 29th, 2019, so we're talking about 6 months or so from when the sex toys were first brought over to Mary's house, well, on this day, Mary was kind of doing chores in her house when she began to smell a really bad smell coming from the hallway closet where the box of sex toys were. And so Mary opened up the closet, and for sure, she could tell the bad smell was coming from this closet. And so she started by smelling the shoes that were towards the bottom of the closet to see if maybe she had stepped in something gross, but they were all clean. And then eventually she reached the sex toy box. She pulled it down from the top shelf and it had never been opened. It's still wrapped, but she just smelled the box and she immediately recoiled because that had to be where the terrible smell was coming from. It was coming from this box. And so Mary was totally repulsed at the idea that these sex toys smell horrible, but she carried the box into the kitchen and set it down, and she thought, is this a horrible betrayal of my friend's trust if I open up this box and look at her sex toys? But Mary ultimately was like, you know what, Carmen has not come back for this thing. I'm opening this up because I need to know what's making this smell. So Mary went over and got a pair of scissors and she cut off the wrapping paper, and then she opened up the box, and inside was like this big thing that had been wrapped in tinfoil. So all you saw was tinfoil. And so Mary, she reached down and kind of began to peel back the tinfoil. It was kind of sticking to whatever was under it. But eventually, after she kind of yanked on it, she pulled the tinfoil off. And when she saw what was in there, she began screaming and ran outside and called the police. It would turn out Mary's neighbor, Carmen, who owned the box of sex toys, well, her boyfriend didn't just break up with her a couple of months before she brought the sex toys over. No, her boyfriend, who was a 67-year-old man named Jesus Baranda, he went missing around the time that supposedly Carmen and her boyfriend broke up. And so naturally, Jesus's family began looking for Jesus, and when they couldn't find him, they called the police. And eventually the police called Carmen and said, hey, you were dating Jesus around the time he went missing. We're going to need to come to your house and search it. And when Carmen heard that, she knew she had a big problem, because Carmen had murdered Jesus and cut his head off with a chainsaw, and she still had his head in her house. And so what did she do? Well, she boiled his head down, and then she put it in a box, wrapped it in tinfoil, and then she wrapped that box in wrapping paper, put a bow on it, and then went next door to Mary's house and said, hey, can you hold my sex toys for me? Because she knew Mary would likely not look in the box if it was sex toys. And so Mary took the box, put it in her closet, and then of course, the smell began several months later, and she would discover Jesus's head. Carmen was convicted of murdering her boyfriend, and she was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Police were never able to locate the rest of Jesus. All they had was his head. But there's a running theory that Carmen may have used the rest of her boyfriend's body and ground it up and then baked him into her croquettes that she gave out to people like Mary and other people in her neighborhood. But that's just a theory.